Sometimes tea just isn't enough. Welcome to Adaptable,
the show where we debate books and their movie adaptations.
I'm Emily.
I'm Paige.
And today we'll be debating Pride and Prejudice.
Before we begin, let's chat about the plot.
And this comes with a spoiler warning, in case, once again, in the last 250 years, you have not read the book or seen any of the 60 different adaptations. The plot starts with
the Bennet family. One mother, one father, a little bit cranky, and 5 sisters, all unwed and of marriable ages.
Which is important because if they don't get married, the family doesn't have any more money because when the dad dies, it goes to a male heir, so the family will be destitute. So Elizabeth Bennet, the second of the daughters, and her elder sister, Jane Bennet, are especially pushed to get married by their mother, Mrs. Bennet, because they are the prettiest and the smartest.
And the oldest.
And the oldest.
Enter Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy.
They are the single men of good fortune who must be in want of a wife. Mr. Bingley is the human form of a Labrador, and Mr. Darcy is the human form of a wet cat.
Sorry. Yes.
When human Labrador Mr. Bingley meets human Labrador S. Jane, they fall in love, and Elizabeth and Darcy do not.
However, as the story continues, Mr. Darcy's character develops. As he develops, we learn he is not as bad as we first thought. We learn this. Elizabeth learns this. In the end,
everybody lives happily ever after.
This time, I will be discussing the book, and as it is not only older, but by far the better of these 2 versions, I'm going to go first. Thank you. Point number 1. Jane Austen's use of language is brilliant. From her very first line, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. To the rest of her book, her use of prose in developing not only characters as well as their inner dialogue and situations makes this book. Jane Austen's use of language varies from clever to a little bit sarcastic to funny depending on the situation. In context, she's writing at a time where the modern romance novel hasn't been invented yet in the way that we know it today, and she is tackling a lot of really big societal topics, and she does this with grace in a book that is also entertaining. Point number 2. While the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice is undoubtedly beautiful, it is a whole lot of beauty and not a whole lot of substance. This version aims to be a Hollywood drama. It turns the proposal scene into a romantic interlude in a gazebo in the rain. We spend 5 minutes of an already shortened version watching Elizabeth sit on a swing. And the hair and makeup is much more inclined to be pretty by today's standards rather than actually true to the period. While this can make for a pretty viewing, it cheapens what is a really beautiful and challenging work into just being a romantic drama. While the romance and the drama is definitely one piece of Jane Austen's story, we lose when the focus becomes making everything dramatic by Hollywood standards. This is no longer something that could have actually happened in history and is just become historic fantasy. Point number 3. In this book, one of the heavy plot points is letters, and a lot of the plot is conveyed through letters. People getting letters, sending letters, and reading letters, where we can both read the letter and hear all of the inner thoughts of the characters gives a richness and a depth that we just simply can't get in any sort of visual adaptation. The way we're able to understand the inner thoughts of the characters throughout the book, whether it is Lizzie worrying about her sisters or the beauty of being able to see and hear Lizzie's thoughts as she's processing Mr. Darcy's letter. The elegance and complexity of this novel simply cannot be contained in a 2-hour fluffy Hollywood piece.
Hold my beer. This is not a fluffy movie. Allow me to explain why. For my first point, let's start with the pretty bits that so offend my partner here. The cinematography in this movie is breathtaking. It is absolutely beautiful. And that's wonderful. That's not anything against the movie. Movies are a visual medium. They should move us with the images they present to us. And this one does. There's moments of isolation where Lizzie is looking out over the cliffs after having turned down 2 different proposals and feeling herself alone in the world. And the camera sweeps across the vista as the music swells, and we ache with her. The beauty does not diminish the meaning of these scenes. At another moment, when Elizabeth is reading the letter from Mr. Darcy that explains his point of view, the camera slowly draws away from Elizabeth as she begins to feel smaller and more lost in the face of information that is so contrary to what she understood. This is a beautiful movie. It is a dramatically lit movie with sweeping music, and that moves us to feel with the characters. To write that off as fluffy or dramatic is to undersell what these images are conveying to us. It is delicately crafted and should incite admiration for the skill we see on screen. Second, this movie does a wonderful job of conveying time, which is really important for the growth of the relationships that we see in this story. At one point, Lizzie is sitting on a swing after Mr. Darcy and Bingley have left, and Charlotte has married Mr. Collins, and she's feeling very alone. And as she swivels in the swing, the environment around her shifts through the seasons. It's a lovely way of conveying the passage of time and Lizzie's sense of isolation. The atmosphere and seasons that the movie manages to convey gives credence to the emotions the characters are feeling, because this is not the story of 2 plucky 20-somethings falling in love in a week. This takes time, both the emotions that grow, and when people are hurt, it lingers. It gives gravitas to what is happening. This movie is very conscious of how much time it takes to move through an emotion, be it negative or positive, and how time can both distance ourselves from pain and other times magnify it. The longer an injustice goes unresolved, the more it hurts. Finally, the greatest thing that can be said in this movie's defense is that it is a romantic film. It cares about what the characters are feeling. Jane Austen is a lovely satirist. She could make people look ridiculous and paint absurdity like no one else of her time could. And because of that, her novel is biting and funny and ironic, and it does a really good job of explaining the complex absurdity that comes when women's occupation is getting married, because suddenly this thing that's supposed to be motivated by emotions also has an economic thrust to it, and how complicated that can make the marriage market. This was wonderful in her day, and she should get all the props she does for managing to convey what this was like for women at the time. But this isn't as relevant of a point today. When we talk about why do we read a novel that is over 200 years old, what in it is still relevant to us, I think what matters in Pride and Prejudice is the emotions, and that's what the 2005 movie highlights. It asks, how do 2 people who don't like each other, and have good reason not to like each other, move from a place of distaste to understanding, to appreciation, to ultimately love? The story, as told in the 2005 movie, is about Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy wrongs Elizabeth. He is a man in a position of power who uses his influence to hurt the Bennet family. Even if he does believe it's justified in protecting his friend, he knows his actions will hurt them, and he doesn't really care. He is concerned with himself and those that are close to him. When Elizabeth critiques him, when she tells him that isn't fair, when he has misjudged and misused the power at his disposal, he agrees with her. Mr. Darcy changes because Elizabeth has correctly assessed what he has done wrong, and he feels the injustice of it. He changes, and doing so earns Elizabeth's admiration and subsequently love. And that is a much more compelling narrative for a modern day audience. We don't have the same class and economic issues surrounding marriage. They're still present, but not nearly as much as they were in Jane Austen's time. So to center a story around them doesn't really hit as hard home. But this need of women to feel that they have been heard, that their pain is not a small thing, and that those who would wish to be partners with them must acknowledge it, that is still incredibly relevant. And that's what the 2005 movie is about, the feelings of these people. How do you move from pride, disdain, prejudice, a dislike of someone, to affection? And that is a story worth retelling.
It is indeed a story worth telling, which is why we have the novel. All of the points you made with the story itself, that comes from Jane Austen directly.
The basic outline, but the focus is way different in the novel. It is much more concerned with the satire,
Much
and
more complex.
and the absurdity of the marriage market, points that just aren't as relevant today. The movie unearths the emotional core and brings that to the center because that's what still resonates.
I would argue the movie strips away the complexities, leaving only one part. Instead of telling a more complicated story that is both the love that you just explained, as well as the layers of context for social norms in the 1800s, you just give us a love story.
But the satire isn't
want
as necessary.
We are watching an 1800s historic piece. We want the context of the 1800s.
No, we're not actually. We are watching a contemporary satire that has since aged out of relevance. It is not a historical piece. It's only historical to us. The story is about what is it like for women to fall in love and seek marriage in their own lives.
So then why is your movie still set in the 1800s?
Because it's honoring the historicism of the novel, but not focusing on those issues because the heart of the story has altered.
I would say it's not honoring the historicism of the novel based on the choices they made. It is beautiful, they have pretty dresses, but it's not honoring the historicism of the novel with the social complexities around it. It's just setting a love story with pretty dresses, so we like it.
But the complexities, as you call them, of the novel aren't relevant to us today, so they just become barriers to us. Explain to me how marrying for money and of a higher social order is still as relevant to us today, and I'll concede that yes, it strips away valuable complexities. But if that's not as relevant, then those are just window dressings.
I would argue it is. Have you ever heard someone say, like, look at their college degree, look at if they're a doctor or a lawyer? Maybe not in our personal lives with our families, but I would say in society, we still look at what makes someone marriageable, and career is still a piece of it. People still look at that.
Relevant, sure, but not nearly as big as it was, so it makes sense to scale that element down accordingly in a story about love and marriage. Since it's not as relevant to us, it shouldn't be as prominent in the story.
Personally, being proposed to in a gazebo and soaking wet clothing is also not relevant to me, yet they continue to put it in.
It's romantic.
You just like Darcy in a wet shirt.
You liked Darcy coming out of a pond. I'm allowed to like Darcy in the rain. The romanticism, the
is
focus
over the top.
Yes, but the focus on emotion is validating to women who often strive for a more emotional touch to their relationships.
It is so over the top that it becomes out of the range of realism. Rather than looking at it and going, wow, this could be me, I see an actual human, you just look at it and you see Hollywood and you go, this will never actually happen in real life.
I see something more akin to the fairy tale or the myth. Sure, it's not directly what I am going to experience in my life, but the truth at the center of it is still relevant, and
so
this simplified version heightens the emotion.
So is the simplified version making it more relevant to me, or is it making it a fairy tale and myth that is not relevant but higher up?
That assumes that myths are somehow less relevant. Orpheus is the story of losing your wife to the underworld and striking a deal with Hades to go get her. That's not relevant to my exact social situation, but the truth of having lost a loved one, wanting to get them back, and the inevitability of loss are keenly human. A story does not have to be realistic to be real to us.
With that in mind, wouldn't you say the difficulties of marriage and comparing marrying someone that makes your family happy and marrying someone that gives you social stability and marrying someone that is your true love but maybe doesn't give you those things, the social complexities, I would argue, that are just as relevant as your myth type analogy.
But those are still present, except through an emotional lens in the film. It's not concerned as much with the social as what that interior feeling is for the characters. And that's how we as a modern audience sort through our problems. Not, is this socially acceptable for me, but how does this make me feel? What does this say about me as a person to seek these things? And that's what the film's concerned with. The interiority of the individual, not how they are perceived by society. That's the difference between romance and satire.
I would agree that's what the film focuses on. However, I would just say that makes the film less than the book. I'm not disagreeing about the content per se. I am just saying that lens makes this adaptation beautiful, but lesser. It turns a classic into something that we, in this moment in time in pop culture, can accept.
But what is a story if not its relevance to its current audience? Every story should be written for those who it knows will be its audience. The idea that this movie is somehow lesser because someone 200 years from now might not connect with it is ridiculous. It's both impossible to predict such a thing, and what would be the value of writing for an audience 200 years in the future when you have one immediately before you that you can speak to? The obligation of the storyteller is to the audience it has, not the audience it might have.
True, but I would say in this case we've seen this novel stand the test of time. It was relevant to the audience it had in 1800. It's relevant to the audience it has in 2022. Whereas I don't personally believe this adaptation is going to stand that test of time. Beautiful in the moment, yes, but not something that is going to be a pillar of literature in the same way that the original novel is.
Okay, I will grant the book will probably outlast this particular adaptation. People will still be reading it after they have stopped watching this movie. I feel like we do have to give credit to this movie, though, for honoring the emotional reality of the characters in a way that isn't absent from the books, but is definitely not as prominent.
So you're saying they're both good, but the book wins?
I'm like, if like the thinnest hair, like not just a hair, like the thinnest hair. Silk thread. That the book is slightly better.
I can accept that. Thank you so much for watching, and please join the debate in the comments.
This has been
Adaptable.